In ancient Egypt, medical scripts dating back before 3000 BC, such as the Ember Papyrus Book, which is shown in Figure 1, reveals their ancient medical practices. Egyptians began embalming bodies as they held the spiritual belief that there may be life after death. This embalming process led to many anatomy lessons for which Egyptians quickly became familiar with the organs of the body. More than 250 different diseases were identified based on these clinical observations, which led to the advancement in treatment and clinical specialization. At the time, there was no known identification of nurses. However, men and women practiced medicine equally, with midwives being mostly women. In ancient India, medical practices were very advanced for the time. Hindu surgeons performed complex surgeries such as tonsillectomies, amputations, kidney stone removals, hernia repairs, nose reconstructions, and C-sections. Illnesses such as TB, cholera, hepatitis, leprosy, and typhoid fever, just to name a few, were all acknowledged and described in these ancient texts. Incredibly, there was even evidence of physicians providing people with immunizations. Ancient documents also provided insight into the importance of healthcare teams. These teams included the physician, the nurse, the pharmacist, and the patient. Although most medicine was practiced by physicians, nurses played an important role as well, often even acting as a pharmacist. With the spiritual belief that men were of higher divinity than women, most medical practices, including nursing, was done by men. Nurses were described as being devotional, attentive, patient, skillful, well-kept, and kind. They were also expected to be unwavering in the willingness to do what the physician ordered, which is something that is different nowadays, as nurses are required to be advocates for their patients. Women may have took the role as nurses in their private homes following a member becoming ill. In ancient India, medical practices China, beliefs of disease and illness stemmed from the connection between an individual, nature, and the universe. There was a strong focus on prevention, and health was considered a constant state of equilibrium and harmony. If there ever was an imbalance in energies, evil spirits would cause illness, discomfort, and disease. 3 legendary emperors laid down the foundation for Chinese medicine through their work. They examined and defined the proper way to determine a diagnosis: to look, to listen, to ask, and to feel, which happen to be used in the nursing process today. The book, The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine, described the ancient Chinese medical records regarding different phases of health and illness, prevention, and treatment. There is a lack of nursing described in ancient Chinese literature, possibly due to the belief that it was a priority to care for ill family members at home, and fear that bad spirits resided in the sick and would transfer to you upon contact. Ancient Greeks believed that gods reflected Earth and the underworld, each having special healing powers. For example, Apollo was the god of health and medicine. However, in 384 to 322 BC, the ideas of philosophers such as Aristotle and Hippocrates, pictured in Figure 2, challenged these supernatural beliefs and illuminated an interesting perception around medicine. The philosopher Hippocrates is known as the father of medicine because his rational approach to medicine made him conclude that disease was in fact not due to bad spirits or breaking moral laws by God, but rather breaking the laws of nature. Hippocrates wrote about the roles of the environment on the spread of disease, the practice of hygiene as a healthy way of life, and the importance of diet and exercise. He also proposed a strong principle in which you must treat the patient rather than the disease. There was not much evidence of nursing roles in ancient Greece. Similarly to ancient India and China, in ancient Greece, women were also seen as less than men. Due to this, it was believed that if there were nursing roles at the time, they were most likely not to be women. This is the table that compares and contrasts the practices of medicine and nursing within ancient civilizations around the world. Overall, it shows that during these ancient times there was not a large nursing presence. In general, although nursing was lacking from most of these civilizations, it is clear that the medical practices were guided by spiritual beliefs. These beliefs also influenced who provided care and how the treatment was given. Primitive people often used basic clinical observations and resources within nature to recognize and treat illnesses. However, with lack of scientific advancement and knowledge, treatments of illnesses became quickly limited. In turn, spirituality became a powerful tool to make sense of the unknown. As we saw in these ancient civilizations, the belief in good versus evil spirits, superstitions, mythologies, and most importantly, religion, strongly influenced how people approached sickness, health, and healing.
The first really concrete time period that marked the beginning of organized nursing was the Christian era. One of the main themes in Christianity at the time was the idea of pure altruism, meaning in the interest of others. So, this idea of pure altruism meant devoting yourself solely for the satisfaction of God. And while other religions at the time believed human suffering was something deserved, the Christian religion specialized in relieving suffering. And as Christianity rose, men and women took on charitable roles within the church by tending for the sick. This idea of caring for others in need was more for the satisfaction of God than anything else. This idea of altruism is still very much rooted in the philosophies of nursing today. This idea of caring for others in a very selfless manner. Another thing to note was that at the time, men and women were viewed as equals in God's eyes. So this created many career opportunities for unmarried women that would have otherwise been non-existent. Christian monasticism was another time period to note. During the Dark Ages, a group of deeply spiritual and religious people came together to form monasteries. The main purpose this group had when creating these monasteries was to escape the chaos of the Dark Ages by creating communities that were removed from the rest of society. These monasteries consisted of men who were considered monks and women who were considered nuns. They lived by many strict rules. The monasteries were a place of innovation in learning. The monks and nuns experimented with many herbal medicines and offered shelter to those that were in need. Eventually, with more and more people congregating to monasteries for shelter and help, the monks and nuns built hospitals and began using their knowledge in medicine to tend to the sick. Another thing to note is that the monasteries kept meticulous records of their work and discoveries in carefully created manuscripts. This has helped us today to identify the role that monasteries played in the early days of organized nursing. During the Christian era, kingdoms in Arabia were some of the most advanced, medically speaking. They built universities where extensive scientific research was conducted, and medicine was a main interest of theirs. The Arabs translated many works of medicine, including those of Hippocrates, and created an extensive materia medica. They also participated in performing surgery. The Muslims are thought to be the first to use catgut for sutures, which is still used today. Physicians at the time were highly regarded and were required to pass difficult exams. The Arabs built large hospitals that were also considered some of the most advanced in the world at the time. The hospitals had clinics for medical students, and wards were separated by disease or type of illness. Some of the wards even had streams of running water. The Crusades were a series of religious wars that occurred in the Middle Ages. During this time, the Turks had gained power of the Holy Land in Jerusalem. Outraged, Pope Urban II called upon the Christians to initiate a war to regain power of the Holy Land. Each Christian soldier was specifically considered a soldier of Christ. As the soldiers continued to fight, the number of injured soldiers increased, and as the armies traveled, disease began to spread quite rapidly. Because of this, nursing military orders came into play for the first time in recorded history. While some of the soldiers were out fighting in battle, others were assigned to take care of the sick. And as more and more injured soldiers filled the hospitals of Jerusalem, a group called the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem was formed. The Knights of St. John were originally a religious fraternity of both men and women that were dedicated to taking care of the sick. They can be considered some of the first military nurses.
The early Christian era occurred from 1 to 500 AD and ushered in the development of nursing in accordance with the beliefs of Christianity. Nursing during this time included helping the sick, poor, and helpless. The act of nursing was a response to the teachings of Christ and viewed as spiritually cleansing. This act of love and mercy would ensure that the follower gained entrance to heaven once they died. Numerous nursing groups, called orders, were formed throughout the centuries as the work of the nurse was undertaken by deaconesses, widows, matrons, and nuns. Deaconesses were rich, able women born of status, usually the sisters of bishops and the wives or daughters of emperors. Deaconesses were unmarried or widowed women that were considered to be able to make judgments based on their life experiences. The primary function of a deaconess was to assist in baptisms of adult women, while their secondary function was nursing. They cared for the poor and the sick by providing food, money, clothes, medicine, and physical and spiritual care. The role of the deaconess disappeared as adult baptisms became uncommon by the 11th century, but there were periods of revival that occurred in accordance with religious movements. Widows were early officers of the church that held more importance than deaconesses, although their duties were closely related. Widows lived in their own home or at a monastery and took a vow of chastity. The title widow implied respect for the age of the woman, as they were required to be 60 years or older. The widows also worked with the sick and poor and played part in the development of early hospitals. Widows originally took their vow of chastity in secret, but once the vow was made publicly known, it led to the absorption of widows by monasteries, making them known as nuns from then on. Roman matrons were the Roman Church equivalent to a deaconess. The matrons were active between the 4th and 5th centuries and were made of upper-class women that had gained social and legal freedoms. These women used their new freedoms to establish a community centered around charity and nursing, specifically caring for the sick and poor. The three most important Roman matrons were Marcella, who is regarded as the leader of the Roman matrons, Fabiola, who founded the first free Christian hospital in Rome in 390, and Paula, who was the first to train nurses systematically and teach nursing as an art rather than basic service to the poor. As the church grew, the social services provided by it expanded as well. Larger institutions for the sick, poor, and needy were created. These institutions housed all groups of people helped by the church and were called xenodatians. These institutions are the ancient ancestor to the modern hospital. Although little is known about the services provided at these institutions, it can be assumed that deaconesses or widows served as nurses. There's no known training for these nurses, although the church eventually formed nursing orders with the primary goal of serving the hospitals. One of the earliest institutions was the Basilius, founded by St. Basil the Great in 370. The Basilius was self-sufficient and self-supported. Out of gratitude, it did not have to pay property taxes, which was an important aspect in the development of the precedent of allowing properties used for religious or charitable purposes to be tax exempt, which is still used today.
What, what was happening during the Dark Ages? The time between the middle of the 5th century, which was the fall of Rome, and the middle of the 15th century, which was the fall of Constantinople, was called the medieval period, which was subdivided into early and later Middle Ages. The earlier centuries were called the Dark Ages, and it was called the Dark Ages as the great civilizations of Rome and Greece have been conquered. The Church's domination over society was unchallenged. In 330 AD, the emperor moved himself to Constantinople, and the pope became the most powerful figure in the West. Bishops became the leaders of the people. All these events contributed to the evolution in the image of the nurse as a saint. The feudal system became the new government, and the feudal system was a military hierarchy that involved granting and bartering land as a trade for military protection. What, what was the care structure like? Well, monasteries were developed as an escape from medieval chaos. Arabs were responsible for developing new methods of caring for the sick and growing the city hospitals. The city hospitals fell under the responsibility of monasteries. Hotel de Lyons was established in 542 AD, and Hotel des Dieux of Paris was established in 651 AD. Hotel des Dieux of Paris is still operating today, making it one of the oldest hospitals worldwide. Santo Spiritual Hospital was established as one of the most well-known city hospitals in 717 AD. Monastic nursing orders flourished, leading to the growing of more city hospitals. Before feudal chivalry, only ladies inside the monasteries were able to obtain nursing careers, but after, nursing careers were brought to highborn ladies outside of the monasteries. Who provided the Who provided the care? In 500 to 600 AD, monks and nuns served as nurses. Monks practiced nursing in men's wards, while nuns practiced nursing in women's wards. Nursing and charitable works developed in monasteries under famous abbess, who were the leaders of the nun communities. As monasteries became more expansive and powerful, nursing was done by a monastic sisterhood. During the time period of 850 AD to 932 AD, Rhazes was one of the greatest and well-known Arab physicians. The earliest nurses were laywomen who were recruited from penitents, which are fallen women who express sorrow for their sins or wrongdoings, and or widows. Eventually, men who were originally servants and later brothers who provided care assisted with the nursing work. What was the education? What was the education like? In 750 AD, pharmacology, being the study of the effects and uses of medications, and medicine, being the study of the treatment, diagnosis, and prevention of disease, became two different and separate sciences, as before they were considered one study of science. In 850 AD, Salerno University was founded, and in 900 AD, the medical school at Salerno was established. The picture in the bottom right references the medical school at Salerno. There was not much education during the early Middle Ages, as religion was their primary mode of information and played a very large role in their knowledge and beliefs.
The late Middle Ages was engulfed by a series of crises starting with the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317, bringing mass starvation across Europe, which was followed by the onset of the Hundred Years' War that continued with rises on off from 1337 to 1453 between France and England. As with any war, the impact on the economy was tremendous, and the decline was also coupled with population decline. Ultimately, what really devastated the late Middle Ages was the outbreak of a deadly epidemic. referred to as the Black Death or the bubonic plague from 1347 to 1352, leading to the death of millions of people. With such death and devastation, caring for the wounded and treating the ill was a central theme throughout the late Middle Ages. This period also saw a rise in new philosophical thought referred to as scholasticism and the beginning of the scientific method. Care structure and providers. Different military order of knights emerged in Europe as nursing orders that expanded the concept of caring for the sick in hospitals. Such as the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem provided care for those wounded in the Crusades. Teutonic Knights provided care in many hospitals in Germany. The Knights of St. Lazarus cared for patients with leprosy and other chronic conditions. Also, the monastery nursing began with the Mendicant orders who took on the primary duty to care for the sick and the needy and the poor. Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Clare of Assisi, and the Saint Dominic were prominent examples of the monastery-derived nursing. During the bubonic plague, the order of the Alexian brothers helped in caring for the victims of the plague as well as the burial of the dead. Provider, Sibyl of the Rhine. Saint Hildegarde was the leading medical authority, considered to be the greatest woman of the 12th century. She was a mystic, scientist, visionary, poet, advisor, and author. She was well ahead of her times because she was able to acquire all this physiological understanding without extensive scientific research, but just based on her prophetic vision. Providers as midwives. Midwives were involved during the late Middle Ages in delivering the infants and not the physician. In fact, the service of a physician in this era was not valued. Centuries later, women in the 21st century still practice as educated midwives. Hospitals in the late Middle Ages provided hospitality and basic nursing. Example, in 1118, St. John's Hospital in Bruges, Belgium, established by Augustinian monks and nuns as a hospice for travelers. In 1101, St. Gilles Hospital was built by Queen Matilda to care for the lepers. In 1247, Bethlehem Hospital was the first institution for the mentally ill patients, and in 1451, Hospital Santa Maria degli Innocenti was built as a founding for abandoned children. Education during the Middle Ages. In 1213, St. Thomas Hospital was founded, which became later the first school of nursing in the 19th century, established by Florence Nightingale. It became a hospital to take care for the sick, a refuge for the poor, and a hospice for travelers and pilgrims.
Even before the 5th century in India, patients were already being treated in the care team model. In this model, the physician was the leader of the team, and it was thought that a cure could not be accomplished without the assistance of the physician. But nurses and patients also held very large roles in this system. Nurses were responsible for being devoted to the patient and their care, along with having the knowledge and being in charge of the management of all medications given to the patient. Patients were responsible for following directions of the providers, being fearless with their trust of the process, and also were expected to communicate with their team on how they were feeling internally between treatments. Today, care teams are heavily relied upon in most healthcare settings and include the patient, their family, nurses, doctors, nutrition, um,
physical and occupational therapy, and many other specialties to ensure the patient is. In many early societies, including the Christian hospitals and Islamic hospitals, care for the sick and poor was based on charity. Out of the 6,146 hospitals in the United States today, 2,937 are considered not for profit, relying on donor funding to assist with providing their patients care. Another 1,174 hospitals are directly owned and operated by state and local governments to provide care to the residents of the United States. Unlike in the Middle Ages, most hospitals and nurses are not specifically tied to a certain religious group, but most nurses go into the profession because they care deeply for the well-being of all patients, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Islamic hospitals were very advanced for their time. Many of their hospitals were broken into separate wards to provide more adequate care. They also built some hospitals to have constantly flowing water within the building to provide fresh water to their patients and staff, and had systems in place for infection control. Wards treating patients with fevers were cooled by running fountains, and nurses caring for the patients were both male and female. Similarly to Islamic hospitals, our hospitals are separated into floors or wards, often based on patient acuity, age, or diagnosis. Hospitals throughout the world have running water or access to fresh water, and care in our hospitals is provided by both male and female nurses. Infection control is always of the highest priority to nursing staff. Guilds have similarities to many different types of organizations in the United States today. Members of guilds paid dues that were then used to provide care in sickness, poverty, and death to other members. Today, health insurance plans in many organizations are very much the same. Employees pay monthly premiums that are used towards care for all employees when needed. Guilds also provide apprenticeship programs similarly to our trade schools. It also sets standards for wages, working hour standards, and set demands for safe and hygienic work environments, similarly to how unions work today. Even in the Middle Ages, doctors providing medical care tried to protect themselves from getting sick. Although germs were not known at that time, and doctors did not know exactly what they were protecting themselves from, they wore long outfits that covered their bodies and masks that were filled with herbs and incense to prevent directly breathing the air when treating patients with the plague. They believed the air upset the balance of the humors. This is the picture on the left. The current picture on the right shows a healthcare provider in full PPE to protect themselves from the Ebola virus. Now that we have the knowledge as to why diseases happen, we are much better equipped to protect those providing care. Before the 15th century, nurses often chose or were chosen for the job because of religious or military reasons. They wanted to serve God and their religion, and taking care of the sick was a way for them to do just that. At that time, formal nursing education was virtually non existent. Today, nurses spend years in formal training and even more time continually mastering their practice once they begin working. Although there are some people who choose to become nurses for religious reasons or as part of their desire for a military career, There are now opportunities for nurses from all backgrounds to specialize in many areas of patient care. Nurses have always played a very large role in the health and well-being not only individuals but of our society as a whole, and that role will continue to grow and evolve throughout time.